The other thing about the Panthers season getting closer is you're starting to kind of wrap up your feelings on the offseason, right? There's not that much you can do. You start looking at it as a whole. I was watching the Hard Knocks Giants off-season Hard Knocks, which, by the way, I think they could just name it something different. They now have off-season Hard Knocks, they have preseason Hard Knocks, they have in-season Hard Knocks with 4 different teams in-season Hard Knocks. It's like the whole Hard Knocks universe. It's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Hard Knocks HBO universe. I was watching it. Panthers, they got so fleeced by the Giants. And I hate seeing, ignorance is bliss. There was a point in time where I looked at the Brian Burns trade and I went, you know what? It feels like they should have been able to get more, but I guess not. Right? And just because we weren't in the room where the decision was made, you kind of had to leave some up to chance. I was watching Hard Knocks. The Giants, I don't even know how they got the return that they gave up for Brian Burns as low as they did, because they weren't expecting anything near it. We talked about this a little bit when they put out the trailer for the offseason Hard Knocks, the little preview, and they showed Joe Shane, the GM of the Giants, and Dan Morgan, the GM of the Panthers, talking down at the Senior Bowl. And, Dan Morgan started, hey, you want to give me 2 firsts for Burns? And I was going, how the heck did they start at 2 firsts for Burns and end at 2 seconds? So I'm watching it, right? And they have 2 episodes out. I watched them both last night. And I'm sitting there watching and I'm paying attention. It's so much worse. So much worse. First of all, Joe Shane, the GM of the Giants, and Dan Morgan are like best friends. They go on vacations together. Their families are friends. Their wives are friends. They talk. Dan Morgan said I don't know if Dan Morgan knew all of this was being recorded for Hard Knocks because the Panthers weren't on Hard Knocks. The Giants were. But he said, we talk every day. We talk every day. Joe Shane jokingly was like, hey, congrats on the new job, Dan, to Dan Morgan at the Senior Bowl. And Dan laughed and said, as if we don't talk every day. This is why I don't want Eric Tulsky doing any deals with Don Waddell. In a friendship that the more experienced GM is going to swindle the less experienced GM every time. In the Giants war room, whatever they call it, the draft prep room, the trade prep room, right? The big room that gets everybody in the same room. They were going through their options at edge rusher. They had established they needed more help on the defensive line. Ironically, because they want to unleash a guy from right around here. They want to unleash Dexter Lawrence. And they thought they either needed another premier pass-rushing interior defensive lineman or an edge rusher that would draw attention and free up Dexter Lawrence in the middle. So that was their priority. And they were going through all the options, right? Hey, this guy played well last year. Do we think he could level up? Blah, 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 blah. They got to Brian Burns. And Joe Shane looked at his guy, right? Because they all have their guy, right? For my cap guy, my scout guy, whatever. Looked at his guy and said, what would it take for us to get Brian Burns? There's no Panther in the room. There's no posturing. There's no reason for him to say, like, when you throw out the first number in a negotiation, you always want it to be super, favorable to you because you figure you're going to negotiate back. Right? You're selling a car that's worth 10 grand. Someone's like, what are you selling it for? You're like 18 grand, knowing you're going to come down. There was no reason to do any of that. It was just Giants in the room. He said, at least a 1 plus. When there was no reason to lie, the Giants were starting their conversations on what they'd have to get Brian Burns with a first-round draft pick plus. A first-round draft pick and more. They ended up paying no first-rounders for Brian Burns. 0. How does that happen? Other than once they got into the negotiation process, Joe Shane just bullied his friend. He just looked at a guy who worked for him, played under him. Right? Joe Shane was in the Panthers. Front office when Dan Morgan was a player. Took a guy that was, maybe even a mentee, and bullied him. Brian Burns, by the way, that the ESPN poll that we talked about yesterday, where they polled executives and other coaches and everything else to rank positions, Brian Burns is a top 10 edge rusher in the league, according to executives and coaches around the league. That is a premier position, top 10 player at his position, and you got swindled in giving him up. This is making me rethink the Panthers offseason. There were a lot of things I liked. Deontay Johnson trade I liked. Some of the things they did in the draft I liked. Love the 4th-round pick. How in the world can a 4th-round pick of Ja'Tavion Sanders truly change the way I think of the offseason when you had a top 10 player at a premier position and you botched getting value back for him? Right? What? By the way, credit to whoever makes Hard Knocks. They got unbelievable access to what the Giants had going on. Like unreal fly-on-the-wall stuff. Congratulations to them. But what it did was it completely lifted the cloud of cover. Right? It completely lifted our benefit of the doubt, right? I don't know how, I guess it seems like a top 10 edge rusher who they immediately made one of the highest paid players on the defensive side of the football in NFL history should have been able to bring back more than 2 seconds in a couple of late round. But maybe not. Right? Maybe it was because he wasn't under contract. Maybe they weren't able to get that much. Then they showed the Giants casually saying like, yeah, 1+. It almost seemed like the Giants were going, and this is reading body language now, not exact words. It sounded like they were going, I hope we could get him for 1 and change. I hope we could get him for first round. Instead, no first rounders.
Ended up being a 2nd and a 5th.
What are we doing here? There's and just the relationship between the GMs made me feel a little awkward. And there was Brandon, like the funny part was, because they all have a connection. Like there's a coaching tree, there's a front office tree. Dan Morgan, Joe Shane, and Brandon Bean from the Bills are all kind of part of that. They were all here in Carolina at one point in time together. So they were all standing next to each other at the Senior Bowl. And as soon as Dan Morgan started talking Brian Burns, and you could see Joe Shane working him, the Giants GM, laughing and, oh, well, you're moving in the right direction, and being a little chummy, but also driving Dan where he wants to drive him, you saw Brandon Bean almost disconnect and look away, like, oh man, right? Like I can't step in and defend Dan here, but like looking away from like a train accident or something once you realize it's on the tracks and there's nothing that's going to be able to happen. I love Hard Knocks. I hate what it did to my opinion of this trade. I'm watching it going, no, he did not just say a first. No. It's exactly what he said.